Noam, professor at Columbia University and director of the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information, a research center at Columbia on issues of media communications, internet technology. We do a lot of research, including on currently on media ownership, on domestic culture in an era of streaming video, and on metaverse economics and policy. Today, we have 190 people who have pre-registered, so the topic is obviously interesting to a lot of people, as are the people who are speaking. Welcome, everybody, old friends, new participants. We have several seminar series. This one is new. It's in its second meeting today, organized and run by Bill Drake. I should say one thing. Normally, I don't speak at our own events because I'm the host. I want to be neutral. I don't want to be a debater. On this topic, however, I felt that, or I feel that in a way, the discussion is fairly one-sided in the sense that a lot of people are rightly concerned about the problems and they see a problem. And there is no real academic other side to this. So I'm going to take that role and not present a splinternet issue, but more kind of the other perspective and argue the other side to provide some heterodoxy and some counterpoint. The role of the neutral today is taken by Bill Drake. Bill is the organizer and moderator. He's known to all of you, I'm sure, from his long involvements in internet governance issues, both as an academic and as a participant in the debates. He's been at several universities, UC San Diego, Georgetown, Carnegie, Zurich. He's been active and he's written a lot on the subject. He has now returned to Columbia, where he is Director of International Studies at our institute, the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information, and he runs this monthly webinar series on digital governance, of which this is the second meeting. So, Bill, go ahead.
Thanks, Ellie, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining from around the world. I'm seeing people in Africa, Australia, US, Europe, Sri Lanka, etc. So it's great to have global participation in a top discussion of a topic that I think is globally significant, which is internet fragmentation, what it means, what its impact is, and what is to be done. I want to take note again that in the invitation, I pointed out that I'm also running a session on this topic on Monday, the 28th of November, in the context of the UN's Internet Governance Forum with a different panel of people. So I think it'll be interesting to sort of go between those two groups and see what kind of convergence or divergence of views emerge. I actually think that there will be quite a lot of divergence of views in multiple directions on this panel. So I'm not so concerned about possibility of any orthodoxy locking in. I will say that, let me just introduce the panel. Then I want to make a few comments to introduce the topic, and then we'll go into a broader discussion. So let me tell you about the August group we have gathered. Cerf needs no introduction, but we'll get one anyway. He's the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, co-designer with Bob Kahn of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the Internet. He's served in executive positions at ICANN, Internet Society, MCI, Corporation for National Research Initiatives, and Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. He has received numerous awards and honorary degrees from around the world and has been widely feted, and of course is a ubiquitous presence in all these kinds of discussions. Ellie Noam, who you just heard from, is Professor of Economics at Columbia University Business School and Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Business Responsibility. He's the director of the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information, the center that is hosting this event. Ellie's published 37 books and over 350 articles, so he's not very active, I guess, including books on ownership of global media, management of media organizations, streaming video, and much else in recent years. He served as Commissioner of Public Services for New York State and in the White House IT Advisory Board. And he has a PhD in economics and a law degree from Harvard University and various honorary degrees himself. Andrew Sullivan is joining us from the Internet Society, where he's been president and chief executive officer since 2018. Andrew has worked on internet infrastructure and standards issues since 2001, when he worked to launch the .info internet top-level domain. Andrew was also part of the team that collaborated with the Internet Society to launch the public interest registry and take over the operation of the .org top-level domain. He was a principal contributor to ICANN's variant issues project on establishing internationalized domain names, and also worked with DYN to establish DYN labs and manage DNS development and architecture there. And finally, we have Tatiana Tropina. Tatiana is assistant professor of cybersecurity governance at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. What?
Yeah.
I'm hearing somebody talk.
Yes.
At Leiden University, and an associate fellow of the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. Previously, she worked as a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Criminal Law in Freiburg, Germany. She's a lawyer by education, and for the past 15 years has been heavily involved in work around cybercrime, cybersecurity, and internet governance, including participating in many of the multi-stakeholder platforms like ICANN, Freedom Online Coalition, and so on. So that's our group, which is a very good one for this particular topic, all people with very strong views. So let me just say a word about the panel dynamics. First, I'll do a little introductory framing to set up the issue, and then we'll do 4 or 5 through the hub around the different aspects of this question, the state of the debate in internet, how do we, internet fragmentation, how do we understand the term internet fragmentation, what are we talking about, what are some of the current and likely impacts on the internet of fragmentation, and as Lenin asked long ago, what is to be done? And then after that, we will, of course, open to discussion, and I see that we have 97 people on this call, so there should be hopefully a basis for a good and lively conversation. So that's our game plan for today. So let me just take a couple of minutes to frame this, because I think it's a topic that, while the word is bandied around a lot, often there's a bit of confusion and lack of consensus about exactly what we're talking about. Internet fragmentation is not a new topic. The discussion about the tension between territorial authority and the internet, for example, borders in cyberspace, goes back to the 1990s. But after Snowden in particular, there's been a bit of a boomlet of debate, which has sort of been growing over time. And you see terms like balkanization, splinternet, fragmentation, all being floated around, used in different contexts. In 2015, I found myself on a panel at Davos with 2 ministers, 4 CEOs, and 3 international organization secretary generals, who were all expressing concern about the growth of fragmentation, which kind of made me think, hey, what's going on here? So I ended up organizing a community process for the forum that led to a paper mapping out the discussion at the time and what were some of the positions being taken. And for that project, I wrote in Vinton, Wolfgang Kleinwecker. And in the years since, there's been just kind of a slow growing bubble of academic studies and debates and policy discussions, including several conferences here at Columbia. But in the past 2 years in particular, there's really been a boom. I mean, internet fragmentation now seems to really be having a moment. Expressions of concern and calls to action on fragmentation have moved up the international policy agenda. We've seen statements and initiatives from the White House, the European Union and its member states, the UN Secretary General, various internet technical organizations, ISOC, the RIRs, think tanks and groups like the Council on Foreign Relations. The Internet Governance Forum that's starting in 2 weeks has got fragmentation as an overarching discussion focus and so on. So there's a lot going on, and yet there's no real consensus about what fragmentation is and is not. In fact, there's sharp disagreement, which may not be evident to people who operate mostly in one echo chamber or the other, but in reality, there's a lot of dissensus. In my case, on Monday, I attended a meeting of the Internet Governance Forum's Policy Network on Internet Fragmentation. Some of the members are here with us today. and heard very broad and expansive interpretations of fragmentation, that the global digital divide is fragmentation, differences in governance institutions are fragmentation, and so on. And then all day yesterday and all this morning, I was on Skype debating with a group of friends who all say internet fragmentation does not exist. There's a lot of noise on the line. The people who say internet fragmentation does not exist, and people shouldn't be using the term as they are. So people are kind of talking past each other from a lot of different angles, and the term seems to be sort of a Rorschach test that people project their hopes, fears, and dreams onto, or maybe it's, the old parallel of the visually impaired persons in the elephant or the Tower of Babel. I don't know, but there's a lot of dissensus out there, which for me as an internet governance guy gives me a sense of deja vu. It reminds me of the debates on the definition of internet governance 20 years ago, when people were talking past each other. And a big point of dissension was whether we should have a narrow definition of internet governance, that we were talking just about management of the core resources, names, numbers, root, and so on, the bits managed by ICANN, or as the governments wanted, the ITU, or rather a broad definition that includes also the usage of the internet for information, communication, and commerce. And a lot of people took to using a simple binary of saying that we were talking about both governance of and on the internet, which is maybe useful for some discussion purposes, but really that binary breaks down pretty quickly. But we're having the same kind of conversation today around internet fragmentation. There are people who take a very narrow view and say that you only have fragmentation if there's an alternate root that billions of people move to, and the whole internet segments into completely separate spheres. And then you have other people who take a broader, more expansive interpretation and see various restrictions on data flows and interoperability and so on as counting as fragmentation. And then there's people who take even broader views and say, well, policy differences constitute fragmentation. So how we address this issue and how the term is framed is important. It can impact action. Again, I just give and I will stop in a second, but just to give you an example, in the internet governance case, I remember very clearly the UN established a working group on internet governance during the World Summit on Information Society to come up with a definition of internet governance, which was then adopted internationally in the UN. And at our first meeting, I was a member of it, and on the first meeting, the Secretary General of the ITU came to the meeting and told us that we should adopt a narrow definition of internet governance, that it was only names, numbers, and the root, and that we should basically say that the ITU should be in control of these things. In the end, the WIGIG instead wrote a report that took a broad definition of internet governance and only mentioned the ITU once in a footnote. Now, if we had taken the narrow approach, then that would have led to one trajectory in terms of how the issue was institutionalized, what issues were put to the forward, what interests prevailed in shaping the discussion, et cetera. If we took a broader view, then of course it led to a different trajectory. I think the same thing may apply here. If you look, for example, at the recent Council on Foreign Relations report on foreign policy for a fragmented internet, you had a group of eminent people say that because of fragmentation, foreign US policy promoting an open internet has completely failed, and we should simply adopt a great power competition mindset to all approaches to internet governance. But they never define what fragmentation means. They say the word over and over, but they never say what it means, how severe it's thought to be, and why that means that policies for open internet have all failed. So, words have consequences, framings have consequences, and we need to, I think, start to have a more productive discussion where we get the different types of perspectives talking to each other and try and bound at least our areas of disagreement. That's what we're trying to do with these two sessions, so the one today and the one at the IGF. So let me turn then to the group and start the conversation against that backdrop. Let's start with just the state of the debate. As I just mentioned in my opening comments, there are these expressions of concern, calls to action that have moved up the international policy agenda, coming from many different directions. What's the panel's general sense of the current moment in this discussion? Why are we having this boomlet of interest right now in internet fragmentation? Is it useful and constructive, or misconstrued and off the rails? Is fragmentation even the right term to capture the range of concerns that people have expressed? what do people think about that? Let me shut up and turn to the panel. Vince got his hand up. Let's start with Vince.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Bill, for a helpful introduction. I would say that fragmentation is not a bad word to use here, but as you point out, we need to understand what is intended by that term. What do we mean by that? And in my view, the original internet design intended a great deal of uniformity. That, you know, when you looked up a domain name, you got the same answer no matter where you were in the internet. You got to the same website, or you got to an identical website in the case of domain names that were anycast. That uniformity, of course, has become broken, and it's broken at many different layers in the architecture, as the 2013 report that you and I and others wrote tried to express. So I would say that we still are seeing brokenness and fragmentation at different layers in the architecture, and they are caused by different actions or by different policy adoption. So as an example, there are some places where domain names are deliberately blocked, or IP addresses are deliberately blocked, and that creates a non-uniform experience depending on where you happen to be in the net. In some cases, non-uniformity is beneficial. An example of that is the ability to do a domain name lookup and use Anycast in order to get to the nearest server. Another possibility is in a content distribution system. When you do a domain name lookup, you may actually get a computed response as to which IP address to go to in order to reduce latency or to distribute load more uniformly. So non-uniformity is not necessarily bad. But we also have terms like data sovereignty, which try to introduce Westphalian concepts in the digital space that don't map very well from the physical geophysical boundary space of the typical conclusions that were generated by the Westphalian peace treaties. So I worry that data sovereignty is used as an excuse to block the free flow of information through the network at whatever layer is chosen. And the bad thing about the blocking of free flow is that lots of things don't work well, including distributed cloud-based environments that would like the flexibility to direct people to any data center that turns out to have available capacity, or replication of information in multiple places for resilience. So I would say that we still have a great deal of fragmentation to deal with at different layers. To give you one other example, the right to be forgotten produces a very peculiar kind of fragmentation. For companies like mine and others that index the World Wide Web, we're told, after you finish indexing, please remember to remove the following responses from the index because those are supposed to be forgotten. So we have to remember everything we're supposed to forget, which is a rather peculiar formulation. So the answer is there's a lot of motivation right now, political and otherwise, to remove uniformity, to block internet access in various locales. For example, in Ethiopia, there was a blocking in the Tigray region for quite a long time. It's now unblocking thanks to the attempts to create a peaceful settlement. So we're still facing a lot of reasons for fragmentation and for non-uniformity. And we'll still have to talk our way through what are the rationales behind those, that lack of uniformity. What, if anything, should we try to do about it? There's strong justification in many cases for that introduce these non-uniformities, one of which is to try to protect people from harm. Don't go to that website, it's dangerous. Block this particular IP address because spam is coming from there. So there are balancing arguments here on both sides, which is why I think it's good that you pointed out that we need to have a broad perspective. So I'll stop there. Thank you for letting me go on for a while.
Yeah, Vint, just to clarify on my question of why now, though, in this way. So basically, if I hear you correctly, you're pointing in particular to government action as driving why we're having this kind of current boomlet of interest.
Yes, there are two obvious things. One of them is governments are saying our citizens are at risk, and therefore we need to take various actions to protect them from harmful behavior. There are some governments who are saying our government is at risk because of what people can do on the internet, so we need to inhibit their ability to do that in the interest of protecting the government. That's classically an authoritarian reaction. The democratic reaction is protect the citizens from harm.
Okay, great. Who would like to jump in? Ellie? Oh, your sound is off, Ellie. Ellie, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I got only 2 or 3 minutes for a opening statement, so I've written this down. The way this gets framed is that we got a big problem of fragmentation, splinternet, balkanization, if that's an acceptable term, and we must do something about it, to save global connectivity, openness, and democracy. And then off we go into actions and options. But suppose we reframe the question and ask, is this noble, yes, noble effort to keep things together in the old ways actually counterproductive? And does it retard technological diversity and innovation? If one type of internet has been good, very good, then maybe multiple internet varieties are even better. How do we know? We must get used to the idea that the future of the internet is not one system, similarly standardized protocols, rules, but a very federated internet using multiple standards and rules and protocols and linked together by various interconnection and interoperation and arrangements. I used to think that this was regrettable, but unavoidable. Even that upsets many people. But now I want to go one step further and argue that it is not just regrettable at all, it is actually a good thing. The single internet was a good system in the past, but not necessarily in the future. Let's talk about inevitability. The internet became essential to everything, and this got different governments involved, obviously, because governments have an interest in those issues in different ways, not just in China, but also in America and Europe, as Vinton mentioned. It's not surprising at all. What is more unusual is that we had a uniform system at all. What we're now experiencing is a return to a normal. And it's not just different countries going their own ways, but also different companies. Companies can do things on private networks that they cannot do over the public network, over the public internet. In fact, the more the public internet becomes regulated as neutral, for example, the more likely network providers will migrate their core traffic to private arrangements where they have more latitude. This is not the public internet anymore then. It is a private internet of private internets. The emergence of such a system of interconnected private internets does not negate the public internet. To the contrary, the two arrangements supplement each other. If the private arrangements are too restrictive, too expensive, discriminatory, then the public system provides a safety valve, and vice versa in the opposite direction. And the next stage after this emergence of interconnected private systems is the divergence of technical arrangements, solutions and specifications. A technical centrifugalism is therefore inevitable. But this does not mean that chaos reigns. Various arrangements and intermediary bridge providers then emerge in order to maintain connectivities and interoperabilities. Such arrangements can also be those of traditional coordinators like ISOC here, or of governments. I'm not a libertarian here. Now, I will argue, and coming close to the end, that such diversification is not just inevitable, but actually a good thing. Of course, standardization helps scale and network effects and other good things. But standardization also reduces competition among technologies. There's a rich economic theoretical literature on this. And in the real world, any brilliant new idea must be approved by an increasingly and inevitably bureaucratized system that will be often based on merit and good solutions, yes, but might also be a deal among various major commercial stakeholders. Why is this a good system? Perhaps it was in the early years when the creation of a critical mass was essential, while economic interests were small. But today, Now, seen in such a light, we have therefore before us a creative opportunity rather than an intractable problem. We should not be banging our heads against the wall, trying to achieve a uniformity which satisfies nobody. Instead, we should find arrangements where different systems can coexist. And that should be the international agenda for internet governance for the coming years. Thank you.
Ellie, can I just ask for clarification before we move on then? So, I mean, the internet itself is a federation of networks, right? You have over 100,000 autonomous systems that choose to interoperate and exchange traffic via TCP/IP IP protocol stack.
Sure.
So when you talk about separate network, are you saying alternate routes like Ethereum and the other alternate route systems?
I'm saying that whatever different providers structure and do deals to interconnect and interoperate with each other, it can be different technologies, different standards, different protocols, going beyond the current system, which is highly with the addressing system, with the coding and other ways, a much more centralized way that exists, and it has worked very well for a long time. No question about it. But that doesn't mean that it's given its success. The internet has been a force of change in everything, and people of the internet kind of recognize this, and they tell people about it. The internet is a disruptive force, but they also have to recognize that the internet disrupts itself too, because it is so powerful. So in that sense, internet disrupt yourself. There's no way to stop that.
Okay. All right. Well, we will come back to the question of alternative nets, alternate routes, things like that in the next section. Just for now, I'm trying to get out on the table, people's sense of the moment, why right now we're having this boom, what's driving this, are we in a moral panic over fragmentation? What's happening? Andrew, where are you on these topics?
Thanks very much. So I do, and thank you for inviting me to this. This is a wonderful panel to have this discussion. I think what was interesting about the remarks that Eli just made is that he seems to be describing as a good thing the conditions that we actually have. I mean, none of and that have persisted over the course of the internet, right? The internet has always allowed for private interconnection, has always allowed for those kinds of diverse sorts of things. The DNS is the sort of global naming system, but you were always able to create your own favorite naming system if you wanted, because it's the internet. You don't have to get anyone's permission. That's kind of the advantage of the way the internet works. So the concern that I have anyway about fragmentation is not that case. I think it's true that people are able to pick these things up and use them the way they want. But the concern that I have really has to do with kind of imposed fragmentation. That is, various kinds of organizations, some of them governments, some of them private entities, impose the control on users in such a way that they can't take advantage of the facilities of the internet, the real one, where, it's end-to-end connectivity and so forth. So, what am I talking about there? Well, some of them have to do with shutdowns. Some of them have to do with data localization policies. Some of them have to do with sender pay arrangements, so that the things that are accessible to people in a given network depend entirely on what contracts their provider has made. Some of them have to do with the idea that you can draw a boundary around pieces of the internet and say, this stuff we're going to allow, and that stuff out there is in the no man's land. And I think that's where the danger comes. This has always been the case, right? It's always been the case that my network, my rules, and I could decide, hey, I'm just not going to route you to that thing over there. So in that sense, the internet is sort of an emergent property of the collective will of all of the various participating networks. And that is not smooth. Everybody doesn't make the same decisions. It's never been smooth. I've never wanted my printer to be on the public internet. That's a bad idea. And that doesn't mean that the internet is fragmented today. But there's a sort of bald man fallacy that goes on in this, right? Well, is it fragmented yet? Well, any given day I lose more hair, and the question is, am I bald yet? That's the wrong question. The question instead is, am I balding? And I think we are headed in the wrong direction. I think as the globe is creating both private incentives, within large corporate structures that are essentially attempting to own the user experience of networked life. And that's a kind of fragmentation. And governments are attempting to impose rules on the behavior of both users and service providers on the internet to make sure that only those things are the right, are the permitted ones. And again, there's a whole cluster of those kinds of behaviors. But I think that kind of fragmentation is something we ought to be worried about. And the reason I think we ought to be worried about it is because it creates the conditions under which we could lose the internet. A couple of years ago, there was this popular trope that was coming around. We'll have the Chinese internet, the US internet, and the European internet. And that's, the world is going to divide up into these political regimes. And I thought that this was a terrible way of describing it, because the alternative to the internet is not national internets or something like that. It's no internet at all. And when I first got connected to the world, I'll finish with this. When I first got connected online, I was not eligible to connect to the internet because I was a mere undergraduate, and the acceptable use policy was still in place, and I wasn't a researcher, so I wasn't allowed to connect. So I had to use these third-rate services, dial-up services and bulletin boards and Genie or CompuServe or any of those kinds of things, and they were fine for what they were. But what they didn't have was this quality of being able to connect to this online world and be able to reach anybody. You had to know where they were before you could connect to them. I think moving towards that world is a mistake. And if we think that it's a mistake, that we don't want these little islands, then what we're going to do is create a mechanism by which the little islands that we are invented interconnect with one another, which of course is the long way around to reinventing the internet. There would be no reason to go through that path just so that we could recreate ways in which the various islands could talk to one another. So what I'm afraid of is, first of all, the loss of functionality that we currently have, and then a big wasted engineering effort to reinvent the thing that we gave up on purpose. Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to the rest of this conversation.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting. Tatiana, I'm going to try one more time on the why now aspect of this. I mean, what's going on? Is this just a moral panic, or is this just a function of government action? Why is this issue suddenly big and exploding?
Thank you very much, Bill. And first of all, of course, thank you very much for inviting me. I actually think I would agree with Andrew's last statement, although I will explain why I cannot call it a fragmentation, but I think that this is exactly why this debate is happening right now. And I think that discussion in terms of framing it a fragmentation is quite useful, although, or maybe even because I do not like the term fragmentation, I do not think it is very helpful, because it is misleading, it is all-encompassing, and it is very much overloaded with different meanings. And what I mean by this, right? So if I refer back to what Ellie said, internet is already a federation. Internet is a mesh of network. It's autonomous systems communicating with each other. So being fragmented, let's be honest, it's an inherent state of the internet. And what makes it the internet is this interoperability and connectivity, right? So ability of these systems to communicate with each other using common protocols, commonly adopted, commonly agreed, using the system of unique identifiers. So from this perspective, I would call internet fragmentation those actions, either creation of alternative standards or governmental actions that break this system or erode trust in it, right? Because it exists, because it was widely adopted by trust, nobody imposed it. So loss of this interoperability. Using the term fragmentation, internet fragmentation, for what I would call fragmented user experience, so various commercial and governmental practices that block content, block IP addresses, it does not happen on this technical layer. The promise of global connectivity is not lost. Remove the government, remove the policy, change the policy, it is reversible. As long as the promise of global connectivity is still there, I would not call it internet fragmentation. So why do I think that it is not a good idea to use the term fragmentation? I see two main negative aspects here. First of all, these content blocking, shutdown, restriction practices. Let's be honest, most of the time they're just purely human rights abuses. They are violation or oppression of the right for freedom of speech, right to seek and impart information. By calling them fragmentation, we are shifting this debate, we are moving the narrative from real problem to some consequence which we cannot even define because most of us cannot agree on the term fragmentation. And second negative aspect I see, and maybe this is something that you said at the end of your first intervention, Bill, by saying that internet is fragmenting and it's all bad, we somehow admit that internet is broken. Perhaps it is true, but I would say that the promise and potential of global connectivity is still there, as long as these networks can still talk the same language and use the same standards and identifiers and so on. Everything that governments do so far, except those initiatives that target DNS or standards directly, and there are plenty of them, does not challenge the dominance of DNS or TCP/IP and so on and so forth. And as long as the new standards that can develop can be interoperable, it's all good. By saying that internet is broken, we somehow, admitting, okay, it's broken, it's not open anymore, let's just give up on this. I just don't want us to give up on this. I want us to admit, while having this debate about content blocking and so on and so forth, that the promise that can be fulfilled, one internet, is still there. We people, governments, commercial companies are trying to split it, are trying to break it, but one internet is still there. It is not fragmented. Maybe it is fragmenting, but this is the subject probably for later discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tatiana. So you object to the category, which is a thing that's interesting thing to come back to. The discussion, my question about the state of the debate is sort of bled into the matters of definitions. So I think we should drive right into that. As I kind of indicated at the outset, I mean, I think a simple way of sort of organizing this question is that there's a continuum of views. On the one hand, you could say that there's a sort of preference for a narrow sort of view, which is, I would argue, what Tatiana is expressing, which is that as long as the internet as long as you've got the root and the naming system and the numbering system working together, et cetera, and it's in principle possible to have connectivity and so on, then these other kinds of things are not fragmentation. So really, you would only have fragmentation if you had a separate root and a whole completely separate different sort of system. Milton Mueller makes this kind of argument as well. You need billions of people to move to an alternate root in order to have fragmentation. At the opposite end of the spectrum, are people take a very broad view. And here I think as somebody referred to, it was Andrew, there was a book by these two British scholars, O'Hara and Hall, who said there are now 4 internets, who think that Europe, China have their own internet and the US has 2. And so they're counting all kinds of policy differences as constituting structural fragmentation and so on. So you've got people take a very narrow view of internet fragmentation. It's only pertaining to the underlying infrastructure. People take a broad view who see prohibitions on data flow, limits on interoperability, and sometimes even further out, different kinds of policies as constituting fragmentation. And then you've got sort of what I would argue is a more middle ground view, which is kind of view that Vinton and I and Wolfgang took in our paper, which says, it's not everything. It's the policy differences are not fragmentation, but things that impede, break, so on, communication, et cetera, can be viewed that way. So a lot of different views. So let's try and dig into this. Taking first the structural, if we differentiate sort of structural and systemic fragmentation of the underlying infrastructure, from sort of process level stuff driven by government policy and commercial practice and so on. On the structural point, do we see now or in the future the emergence of entirely separate roots and systems taking hold, blockchain-based or whatever else, that will somehow lead to a substantial structural fragmentation of the net? And should we see such a structural fragmentation? It sounds like Ellie is saying there should be such a thing. Or is this not a realistic concern right now? We can focus more on other levels. Vint, what do you think about that?
Well, I just put a little note in saying ambiguity is not your friend in the internet world. One of the rules that we tried to adopt in the IETF is that if you're going to do something, do it one way so that there isn't any question about which way to do it, and you don't have a negotiation to figure out whether the end-to-end property can be maintained. So I think my concern here is that user experience and the freedom of moving information, around the world, getting access to information wherever it is really has been very important in terms of the internet's value. And things that interfere with that free flow really do interfere with value. So it's an example if you insist that your information can't go to certain parts of the world, then you make the data center networks not work anymore because you say that you can't copy this data into that data center, and therefore you're not allowed to use that for resilience, and people potentially lose information as a consequence of that. So really, holistic ability to move information around and to get more or less uniform experience and results is very important. However, I understand the political concerns that are expressed either with regard to people's safety and security. We don't want traffic coming from this direction because we think it's harmful, or we want to find a way of blocking information that we think is harmful. Is all understandable. The question is, how do we respond to real risk factors without losing the most valuable property of the internet, which I see as end-to-end interoperability?
Okay. I'm not sure you answered my roots question, Vint, but that's okay. Let's go to Ellie. Your thought on that?
Yeah, thank you. I understand the concern about the complexity of end-to-end, and clearly a fragmentation will make that technically somewhat more complicated, but it's solvable. We have such great faith in you technology guys. I mean, we have different countries. I mean, I know any analogy is a bit labored, but take phone numbers or zip codes for mail. So each country has a somewhat different system, and yet somehow things arrive in time. And so I think arrangements could be found. It's clearly uniformity has some advantages. Nobody's arguing against it. But you kind of, as the internet pervades every aspect of society, it's unavoidable the society will also pervade the internet and will have its priorities. Each country, each government, not necessarily the same, will impose different priorities because the internet is not the only thing that people care about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Andrew, your thoughts on this structural or systemic sort of fragmentation, creation of completely alternative systems?
So I'm always, whenever anybody tells me about a completely alternative system, I really want to pull on that thread, because like a completely alternative system, of course, is one that doesn't interoperate at all. It's a separate system, and we know how to build those. I mean, we have networks that are completely disconnected from the internet. And you want those kinds of networks, right? These are the so-called air-gapped ones. When your air-gapping fails, that's how, the entire contents of some database that wasn't supposed to leak gets onto the internet. So we know how to build those completely separate ones. A lot of the supposed completely separate ones are really are really replacement proposals, right? So they're alternatives to existing ones. So we have some of those, the so-called handles system, which has been through several different iterations, but basically it's an alternative naming system for the internet. Amusingly, the way you get started in that system is you look it up in the DNS. So that sort of indicates the probability with which you're going to replace this kind of system. And I think that is one of the important questions that people have to ask. Like when they come along with a total replacement for the DNS and they say, oh, I want to replace this naming system with a completely different thing. What they need is a path to upgrade all of the known computers in the universe before they get started. And if they don't have that plan, then they have an incremental deployment problem. An incremental deployment problem inevitably roots itself in the existing system that you have, which means then that you've got this sort of bare bones kind of thing. And now you have an incentive problem of upgrading all of the systems. So I actually am much less concerned about these proposals to completely replace stuff. Because if something completely comes along and completely replaces everything, so what? That's what happens. Arguably, for instance, TCP/IP is sort of gradually being chipped away at by QUIC. Because TCP has all this overhead, and so people are trying to chip away at it. Nobody will notice if this actually happens, because the way that it will happen underneath the hood in such a way that it won't actually affect you, because it is incrementally deployable. So that's the kind of fragmentation that I simply do not worry about. What I worry about instead are the structural fragmentations, and I do think these are structural fragmentations, where people intervene, governments in particular, or various kinds of policymakers, intervene in a way to try to prevent the network from interoperating in the way that we would like. And so examples of this are everywhere today. Some of them happen in private networks and social media things that are really attempts to get you to nail yourself to one particular application environment as opposed to the internet. So all of the apps that lock you in. But the other thing are policymakers' efforts, for instance, to undermine TLS 1.3 or to undermine QUIC or to undermine DNS over HTTPS or all kinds of other kinds of things, where governments are attempting to do that basically because they don't like the censorship knob being taken away from them. And that's a case where we really are going to fragment the experience of the internet by government fiat, because people don't get they don't get access to certain technical capabilities that the network would otherwise offer it.
Okay, so people not getting access to technical capabilities is a user experience level thing, and some of us agree that could be called fragmentation. Others of us don't.
But that's what I'm disagreeing with you about. I mean, okay. If I intervene, if I am the policymaker and intervenes and says, you network need to have a sender pay arrangement such that the network, such that the only people who can send packets across your network are the providers who paid you money. That is a technical intervention in the infrastructure. It has these consequences for the network, but it's really a discussion about who may connect to one, to whom, and that's really a technical layer thing. So maybe what it is that I'm quibbling a little bit with the distinction that you're trying to make, because it falls apart right away.
Right. Most binaries do. We actually don't disagree on that point. However, you and Tatiana do disagree. So Tatiana, you're next.
Bill, yeah, that's a perfect time for me to intervene a bit, because I think that you got my narrow understanding a bit wrong. So for me, internet fragmentation is not only about let's create alternative route and then internet will fragment, let's create new IP and we will fragment the internet. As others, I actually do not see it coming. I do not see non-interoperable standards coming so quickly. Mostly what I saw so far is either interoperable or fixable or has too much of incremental cost for deployment. So the uptake of this is somehow uncertain. I'm sorry, pie in the sky, right? But I think that narrowly defining this structural or systemic fragmentation, which, and here I agree with Andrew, defining it only as some intervention in form of alternative route, to me seems too narrow, because I think that here we too much focus on the technical side of it, right? Calling it systemic fragmentation. And I think by doing this, we somehow envision that some new standard will come and break what we have, while thinking that what we have is somehow exists, right? And cannot be broken in any other way. But I think in addition to technical aspects of what we have, interoperable internet, again, I'm bringing it back to unique identifiers, protocols, standards, and their interoperability and the promise of global connectivity. It's not only about technical side only, it is also, and I said it already, it is about trust. They exist because community widely adopted them by putting trust in them. Cerf invented this standard and he did not impose it on this community, right? Community put trust by wide adoption, and this is what happened. This is the first aspect, trust. And secondly, the governance model. The global multi-stakeholder governance model. So somehow we think that the current system can be broken only because of alternative route. No. There are certain governmental policies, and here I'm coming to what you might call governmental fragmentation or behavioral process fragmentation bill, but I think they're intertwined because some of the governments are already imposing policies that are trying to tackle DNS. Or standards. Look at what the European Union is doing, for example. This NIS2 directive proposal, thankfully, this is off the table now, but there was regulation of root zone servers. This might erode trust in the current model of governance. This might erode the current model of governance itself. And this might not immediately result in the loss of connectivity like alternative route would, which in my opinion is not happening. But it might erode trust, and it might lead to what I would, in my narrow sense of visually impaired person approaching the elephant, call internet fragmentation. It might happen not because of alternative route or competing standard, but because some governmental or international policies will erode trust and erode the current model of governance. And this is my concern.
Sure. So actually, we don't disagree. It's just I was trying to bracket the question of alternative root-based systems and address that first separately, because some people seem to be expressing concern about that and desires about that. Let's turn to the other kinds of cases, though. So the kinds of interventions that Tatiana was just talking about, or that Vint talked about before when he talked about data localization, data sovereignty type measures, various things to block IP addresses, DNS queries, and so on. These can be, you can have a lot of different things happening in a process sort of way through the actions of governments or firms. And the question is, do we count those as constituting fragmentation or not? And I think we've heard different sorts of takes on that, some a little bit more expansive than others. So if we're looking beyond this simple underlying structural question, are there alternative routes to instead the kinds of measures being taken by firms and governments? What do we see as being the most pressing cases? Tatiana just mentioned one with regard to the EU initiative of its proposal. But what else? What do we see as being constituting now appropriately something that can appropriately be called fragmentation? Vint.
Why don't you open it to the audience?
It's Vint. Just an immediate response. One of the things that I worry about is that there are so many different ways to essentially inhibit the ability to get access to information anywhere that it exists on the internet. And so a lot of fragmentation for me is interference with this end-to-end capability. And those interferences can occur in a variety of different ways. It could be that the routing system could be interfered with by publishing, BGP routing updates that cause black holes to happen, or you interfere with the ability of DNS to do lookup by demanding that all users in your geophysical territory must use a particular kind of DNS resolver that's sanctioned by the government. And oh, by the way, it has certain properties that interfere with this ability to resolve an address or resolve a domain name to go to everywhere. So my concern here is that governments are using the technical elements of the internet as a way of imposing policy and in ways that make the internet not beneficial.
Right. And I guess the debate we're having is that some folks acknowledge that those things are happening, but do not think they constitute fragmentation. And this is what we're trying to get our...
Well, then, instead of arguing over what's fragmentation, could we please talk about what outcomes we want to happen? And for me, I want open and free flow of information to the degree that's possible and is consistent with safety and security, protection of privacy, and other interests that the users reasonably have and expect.
Let's tour the top on this one and then come back to what should we done and what do we want, and then we'll go to open discussion. Andrew, your hand up.
So I agree with Vint, but I think it's also important to emphasize the number of layers where this is happening. So for instance, there's been a lot of discussion, for instance, about the various European acts that have happened, have come into effect just at the beginning of the month. A lot of those are specifying, particular behavior of online services. But they're sort of bringing they're sort of bringing requirements about what an online service has to be in order to solve a problem of particular online services that people are trying to solve. And so this specifies a kind of technical requirement, sort of you must be this tall to get on the internet ride. And the problem with that sort of thing is that, a different architecture may challenge it. So the most obvious example of this is that it's clear that European regulations that have just come into effect are really designed to solve something that is partly related to Twitter. And given the current upheaval at Twitter, a whole bunch of people have moved off to Mastodon. But Mastodon's architecture is fundamentally different. And so it's not clear actually how these regulations apply there or whether they apply. And it's certainly not clear that any of the volunteer operators of those servers are going to have anything like the resources necessary to comply with these regulations. That is an environment that creates legal and technical facts that new service operators have to conform with. And I guess then I'm in agreement with Vint here that, whether this constitutes fragmentation in the narrow or wide sense, or whether it's fragmentation or some other kind of problem, is less interesting to me than the reality that this is creating a situation in which the networks tend not to interoperate with one another, and they tend not to interoperate with one another by government fiat. That seems like a bad thing, no matter how we call it.
Tanya.
I finally can come in violent agreement with the previous speakers. I so much agree that it doesn't matter if we call it fragmentation or unifragged or whatever. To me, actually, what Vint and Andrew were talking about is much more dangerous trend than what I, in my narrow sense, call fragmentation, right? Control and regulation imposed on the internet, sometimes it is ridiculously unenforceable, and sometimes it indeed can break the flow of information, and it can break internet as we know it, even though not on the logical layer. And I very much agree with Vint. And Vint, I'm sorry if I'm not quoting you correctly, but I think that let's stop talking whether it's fragmentation or not. Let's start thinking what can be done about these practices. And to me, what is really important here is that we think about governments who are trying to protect their citizens, right? Then we look at authoritarian regimes who are imposing restrictions and control on the content and free flows of information. The tools are strikingly similar, right? Data localization laws, content restriction laws, various regulations. So where do we draw the line? And do we, as democratic states, let's say, are using the same narrative, the same instruments, and going into the same mire as just digital authoritarianism. So to me, it is indeed so. Where do we draw the line? It doesn't matter if we call it fragmentation or not. What is done for safety and security can be done with the same ridiculous instruments that can limit connectivity. How do we distinguish, and what can be done about this? And of course, I have some ideas, but it should be very nuanced than just simply say, okay, it fragments, okay, it does not fragment. We have to look at every of these intervention and see how it affects the internet or its connectivity.
Okay, thank you. Ellie.
The example that Vint gave about the data localization is a good example, because in some ways it's easy to argue against authoritarian restrictions. But when it comes to, say, European countries, democracies, imposing certain restrictions here, the question is, in some ways, if we argue against it, aren't we arguing against democracy ourselves? And is this kind of a bit of the experts know better than the people and their representatives? So that's a very fundamental question, and it kind of goes far beyond the internet. It's a very classic type of situation of experts versus Democrats.
So it's Vint. I wanted to react to Ellie's observation about the sort of data localization. If you really care about protecting data, it's not where it is that's important, it's whether or not it's encrypted and protected access. And so if you want to protect information, but you want the internet to allow it to go anywhere, then use cryptography as your tool for that protection, and only allow keys to be allocated to parties who should be authorized access. That preserves the open flow of information, and at the same time allows access control to be exercised.
I have no problems with, in fact, I think that data localization is a bad idea, but it's a legitimate position to take for duly elected governments and to take, and in some ways, if you don't like it, you need another governmental process. But that's the one you got, and it's a democratic process, and it's not on your side.
It's an industrial policy process. I didn't know that you were a defender of protectionism, Ellie. This is new for me. Okay.
No, I'm against democratic. I'm in favor of democratic legitimacy, and against the rule of the experts.
Okay, just quickly, Andrew. Then I want to do just a quick spin on what is to be done, and then open it up to conversation, because we have over 100 people online here, and I'm sure we can get some other voices at the table. Andrew, just close.
Thanks. So I actually want, maybe I'll offer you a hook for that, what is to be done, because I think Ellie's point is a valuable one, having to do with governmental legitimacy, but we also wouldn't think it legitimate if the government attempted to legislate the value of pi. And in several cases, there are things that governments are attempting to do that are, that basically presume that because the internet is an invented system, therefore it's infinitely plastic. But that is false. When you create a large socially transformative technology, it creates facts. It creates facts of the world. And there are facts about how the internet works that are constraints on what you can do with it. And if you undertake acts that are outside of that, you don't fragment the internet, you break it. And I think that's the, sort of critical part of this, that, experts do have to be involved in those discussions. That isn't to say that we should be technocrats and, establish the rules for the world. But I think that expertise in how the systems function is an important part of that legitimate public policy. And so part of what is to be done to, turn to your next question, so you don't have to ask me twice, is actually to ensure that this debate functions with proper information about what is really happening to the internet and what the consequences of those policies are. And also to call out governments who, are clearly warned and then say, well, damn the torpedoes, we're going to do it anyway, which is something that we're seeing all the time. So I think that this is actually a reality that the internet community needs to be willing to stand up and say, sure, we understand what it is that you want, but what you are doing is harmful to this marvelous social technology that we all depend upon.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Mike, I'll come back to you when we open it up to the floor. You'll be first in line. Ellie, what should be done?
we should incentivize and think through interoperation and interconnection arrangements that would bridge the inevitably emerging fragmentation tendencies so that we have, in fact, technical solutions backed up by economic actors, backed up by technology that would make it possible for us to bridge a fragmented, federated, fragmented environment.
Okay, thank
And
you.
that could be something for ISOC to do.
There you go. You got your marching papers, Andrew. Vint.
Well, I think I like what Ellie said, which is that we need to find ways of let me put it this way. I think we need to find ways of preserving the properties that have made the internet valuable. And that is largely the free flow of information and the uniformity that the internet has attempted to introduce, while at the same time recognizing that there are harmful behaviors that use this neutral platform and amplify harmful effects. We have to help governments respond to that, and we have to find ways to do that still preserve the utility of the internet. This is a non-trivial exercise, and I think we are going to end up looking for international cooperation to achieve the objective, because in order to cope with accountability, which I still believe is an important property, you need to have international cooperation to achieve the objective.
Thanks, Vint. Okay, Tatiana, you get the last word.
Yeah, so as I said already, I think there should be a very nuanced approach. I do think that the most important danger or most imminent danger are various governmental policies, whether they lead to what I call fragmentation or whether they do not, okay? So I do think that, well, first of all, it was already said that we should call on those governments who are actually doing this. But I think, because I'm a lawyer by education, as you introduced me, Bill, and I'm very much into, kind of practical application of these tools and not just talks. And I think that the closest I can think of, and maybe I'm doing Andrew's job here, is this ISOC tool, ISOC assessment tool, Internet, the way of networking, where you just go through various, like kind of points, and you see, okay, does it affect this? Does it affect that? So we need some systemic approach, and some developments of this systemic approach are already here. We just need their wide adoption. We know what internet is. We know what open interoperable internet is. We know what these properties are. So we can take any regulatory initiative, any technical initiative, and just compare it against this. And as I said, I'm talking about ISOC just because this is the best so far which comes to my mind in the absence of others. But perhaps, Andrew, maybe ISOC can do a better job to promote it, or maybe we as international community can do a better job of creating a new one. But there should be something, not only our talk, there should be some framework which we can take and go to the governments or policymakers or international organizations and say, look, this is what you're doing. And if you want to continue doing this, please know what the consequences are.
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. So I think we're in agreement that we should all push back on bad policies and bad initiatives and try to encourage governments and other actors to come towards the light. I don't know that we have agreed or pointed towards agreement on shared understanding of fragmentation per se. It may just come down to semantic differences that some people prefer to call certain types of blockages, impediments, fragmentation, and other people simply do not. But the problem, my concern is lack of consensus on that point. There's the possibility that we leave it then out there for people to abuse the term and take actions based on the term. And when I look at things like the Council on Foreign Relations telling people in the State Department and the US government that we should take a more militaristic kind of approach because fragmentation is everywhere without having a clear understanding of what that means. And I think of what's going on in the UN and other contexts, I worry that not having a more bounded shared understanding can be problematic. But that's just my own view, and maybe I just obsess too much on matters of definition. So we have time now. We've got over 100 participants here, so let me open it to the floor. Can I ask, of course, that people introduce themselves briefly and try to limit themselves to a minute or so, so that so that we're able to go around and get responses from everyone. I see a lot of discussion going on in the chat space, so I hope some of those folks will choose to speak up here. Mike Nelson, we can always count on you to get the conversation going. So Mike, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to try to simplify and complicate the issue at the same time. Here in Washington, D.C., I'm at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and have done a lot with the Internet Society chapter in D.C. About 5 years ago, we did a series of 4 very good virtual panels, or actually in-person panels that were webcast about fragmentation. And so we nicely subdivided it into, the technological questions, the business arrangements, the cultural issues, and then the policy issues that lead to barriers between different components of the internet. But the way I wanted to simplify this was to get people to think of the stack. And when people say fragmentation of the internet, they mean everything from the Indian government blocking TikTok at the application layer down to the Chinese trying to push new IP. And in between, we have various domain name issues. It's really helpful every time someone says fragmentation of the internet to point to the area that you're actually focused on. But the complication I wanted to bring in is it's not just about fragmentation of the internet, it's fragmentation of the cloud. We just did a very nice book looking at Korean and Indian data policy and how they're trying to subdivide where the data lives. And the other thing we need to look at is money localization. If we look at what's happening in Russia right now, they're being cut off from certain parts of the internet because they can't afford to pay for the services, or they can't use credit cards to pay for some of the internet services that they rely on. And that's, VPNs, that's caching services. I mean, there's web hosting services that they can no longer pay for. So we don't need to just focus on the internet architecture. We need to look at who can actually take part in the e-commerce services that everyone relies on to make the internet work.
Thanks, Mike. Why don't we take let's take a bunch of interventions, or as many as we can get, and then have the group, the panel come back to them rather than doing it sequentially and having the panel respond to each one. So next up, I see the hand of Mallory. Mallory, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. 1 second. There you are. Yeah, thanks a lot for your talks. It's a really interesting conversation. When I hear the question, what's the biggest threat to the internet and its fragmentation, I think of post-neoliberalism. I mean, the whole world is sort of fragmenting in a lot of structural ways. Mike mentioned finance. Financial markets are in chaos. Global shipping is in chaos. I mean, the internet can just get in line, I guess. And it's also, I think, hard for economists and folks who have thoughts about this to care that much about the internet when it does seem there are bigger problems facing us. So I guess my question, and it is a genuine question, I'm super curious on what all of you think. What is the value of the internet in a post-neoliberal world where, for lots of reasons, we might actually there are folks who think we should fragment because then that isolates risk. So as, climate change starts decimating and creating more chaos in other places, maybe we should just save the good parts, right? And so I think this is increasingly going to happen, whether we want it to or not. But I just wonder what you genuinely think. Take all the globalization away. What do we need the internet for?
Thanks, Mallory. That's a nice provocative question. Lee McKnight.
You're muted, Lee.
Okay, so we're all
Well, I'll just go ahead and say it. I think we're all looking at this backwards. You're focusing on the fragmentation when what we're witnessing, I can't kind of what Mallory just said, is decentralization, which is kind of natural at this stage in evolution of the history of the internet from its roots. So of course, the internet is getting more varied and more complex over time as it becomes more embedded in more nations and cultures at all kinds of levels. Doesn't mean it's, but on the other hand, going back to that first question, the question just mentioned, like what's the use of the internet? The fact is who's walking away from the internet core protocols. People may be trying to invade around the edges of it, but nobody's going to disconnect per se from the internet. Vinton did too good a job all those decades ago. There's too much value in being part of the same, geopolitical economy of scale and scope and all that. So so on one level, I say, let's look on the bright side. The bright side is we're decentralizing. That's a good, healthy thing at this stage. Of course, there's some bad aspects too, and I'll shut up.
Okay, that's certainly, there's no question that, and indeed, many of us have said that some measure of fragmentation is an inevitability and a function of the evolution of political systems, et cetera. Do we have more questions? We have all these people chatting on the side. Anybody want to speak up before I circle back to panelists or no, I could try to dig back through the long discussion over here in the side to pick out some questions, but it would take a while. All right, let me just turn back to the panel right now to respond to the three comments we've had so far. So Vint, go ahead.
Well, I noticed that Mike Nelson still has his hand up. Is that a legacy hand, Mike? Okay. Yeah. Have you noticed this interesting vocabulary that we've had to evolve, like you're muted and legacy hands? It's fascinating how that evolves. Well, I liked very much the observation that the utility of the internet is reflected in many ways in its interoperability and ability for people to connect. And it seems to me, in the face of some of the really devastating challenges that lie ahead of us in global warming, we need more cooperation. We don't need fragmentation. We don't need isolation. We don't need circle the wagons because, for example, the atmosphere is shared by everyone. Pollution is distributed everywhere. Internet needs to be there and in place and available to help us solve these problems in the same way that it helped to deal with the pandemic. Yesterday, I was in an event where Francis Collins spoke. Francis was very much involved in the original sequencing of the human genome, but he was also very much involved during the pandemic period as an advisor to the White House. And I would say that his argument is that we need more collaboration, not less. We don't want barriers to that kind of cooperation, or we will really have a hard time solving any of these problems.
Okay, thanks, Vint. I'm going to take, before I go through more panelists, when people from the larger group raise their hand, I'm going to pull them into to get new voices. So Nigel Hickson.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for this excellent discussion and the panelist time. I suppose in this closing segment, I just had a question that, given the multitude of discussions that are taking place on internet fragmentation, and whether it's at the IGF or ICANN or elsewhere, where do the panelists think that we should be going on this? Should there be a collective global effort to try and write a paper on this, or try and have a sort of discussion somewhere, and where could that be? Thank you.
Yeah, that's Nigel. What I was kind of it's easy for everybody to say we should take actions to defend the open internet, but I want to know, how do we advance some shared understanding about fragmentation, what it is, what it isn't, because it's getting used out there by governments and all that. But anyway, so that's where I am. Tatiana, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment first of all on Lee's intervention about nobody's getting disconnected, and this is what I was alluding to in my very first intervention about internet fragmentation. All these countries that impose geo-blocking, content restrictions, internet shutdowns, ultimately, they are still connected to the global network. China is connected, Russia is connected, nobody is disconnecting them forcefully. So as I said, the promise of global connectivity is still there. Although, of course, as I said, various blocking, to me, also human rights violations still exist, and they're a very bad trend, very dangerous one. About the value of the global internet, well, I'm sorry for mentioning this. I hope that this word is not banned here. Global pandemic, I'm sorry, maybe it didn't affect some, maybe for some people internet wasn't important, but my elderly parents live 10,000 miles away from me. Internet is the only way which connects me with them. I cannot travel there. I cannot travel there even now. This is the first point. Secondly, during global pandemic, I gave lecture at the university. Many students could not come to The Hague. They were joining from all around the globe. The promise of global connectivity, which is still here, is the value of internet for me. And let me circle back to that comment about nobody is getting disconnected. And I believe that whatever countries are imposing restrictions on their users, the global value of this connectivity is still there. We're just not using it to the full potential. Maybe we never will, I don't know, but it doesn't mean that it is not here. About what to do. Bill, this is a very interesting question because, of course, I mentioned these assessment toolkits. I do think that on the one hand, we need some more overarching approach, right? So like, for example, preserving the interoperability, preserving the global, the model of global governance, the multi-stakeholder model, committing to it, let's say, preventing the ITU takeover. And I think that this can be, of course, done within the frameworks like, I don't know, Global Digital Compact or whatever, but I'm still wondering about the enforceability. But what I think would be important is what has been said already. Various parts of community, and especially technical community, civil society, academia, who believes in the value of open and interoperable internet, actually reaching out to those governments who are doing intentionally or not so intentionally, who are imposing these restrictions, who are developing these policies, and actually explaining in a very granular, nuanced way, what are you actually breaking? And if you decide to break it, what is going to happen? So if you want to break it, okay, but then do it intentionally and know what the consequences are.
Thank you for you saying this word, though. This is my point, is what breakage counts, and this is where it is agreed. So if the argument is countries are connected, but the citizens are not, therefore there's no fragmentation, that's an argument. There are other arguments, though, that say, no, that breakage, the citizens not, is fragmentation. So I've lost
Two fingers, Bill. 2 fingers. I think that using the word fragmentation here is just, it loses its meaning whatsoever. I mean, okay. It's more about preserving what internet is. Maybe it's a better term.
Okay. Vint, I think I just called on you a second ago. Can I go to Ellie first and then circle back to you? Ellie.
Yeah, we had some really interesting comments by Mallory and by Lee. Mallory asked and they both put the internet fragmentation issue into a broader context of centrifugalism of lots of processes around the world. So we should not be kind of like tunnel vision. So the question is, what's the internet good for? Well, as Tatiana said, just look at what happened during COVID. Imagine we had this pandemic without the internet. So clearly, this has accelerated an environment in which we work on the internet, live on the internet, shop on the internet, transact, do everything on the internet. And so in that sense, it will become more fundamental than ever. The question, of course, is what is the internet? And here, Lee basically kind of makes a good point, which is as it becomes more important, governments will interfere, and that's what governments do. And there's nothing illegitimate about this. It's totally predictable. And that means that since we don't have a unified world, there will be different approaches. And we should have to learn to live with it and find arrangements to deal with it.
Well, presumably we want to push back on the particularly egregious and injurious parts, right? I mean, We don't necessarily want to see governments, the EU model is one thing, Chinese model is another. No, Ellie?
Oh yeah, well, nobody argues for passivity here, but we have to realize that there's only so much that we can move the needle in many countries, and so inevitably there will be divergences. And there's nothing wrong with it, because what makes sense in one country will not make sense in another country, and why should it?
Okay, great. So I'm going to go to Andrew, and then Vint, you can close it, and then we will terminate this. We're reaching towards the end of our time, and I'll mention the next event in this series. So Andrew, go ahead.
Thanks. So I really want to push against this idea that like nobody's disconnecting from the fundamental connectivity, or China is still connected was another example that I heard. I mean, I don't agree that China is part of the internet. I think that China has a gateway to the internet for a bunch of consumers inside China. And it's a filtered gateway. It's sort of like China Online, the way America Online used to be. You kind of had a gateway to the internet, but you didn't actually have access to it. And the reason this is important is because the internet has this feature of being, this network of networks, and you can run one of them too. The mere fact that you're using TCP/IP is not what makes you part of the internet. It's rather the ability of your network and other networks to participate as networks with one another. And you cannot peer in China because you're not allowed to make routing announcements. And so that's true, by the way, in a number of other countries. And the number is getting bigger by government policy. And this is a way in which the internet, the actual fundamental foundations of the internet, are being eroded for high-level, application-level social concerns. And so what I think we need to do is focus on the user experience of this network, because ultimately it is the most social technology we have ever invented. It encourages this connectivity with one another. And that's why I said earlier, when the question, what is to be done, I said, we have to start calling this out. We have to start calling out. And I appreciate Tatiana's pointing at the impact assessment toolkit, because that's the purpose of that, to allow us to say, okay, we understand what you want to do. What you're trying to do is going to break stuff. We're not a sovereign government. I'm not in a position to tell you you may not break stuff. But the truth of the matter is that, I want you to do that. I want you to do it in public and tell everybody, yep, we're going to break things on purpose. If you want to do that as a sovereign government, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, so Vint, if I could ask you to close things out. Go ahead.
Well, frankly, what Andrew said is a perfect closure, I think. What we need to do is recognize the potential harms that are introduced into Internet's operation for reasons that are in some cases fully understandable, but which don't accomplish the objective, which is, in my view, preserve the Internet's value and protect the users of it at the same time, a non-trivial exercise. You asked earlier, where should we address the problems? And there are many different venues in which they can be addressed. Some of them are existing international organizations like the World Trade Organization or the Internet Governance Forum. And in fact, at the upcoming Internet Governance Forum, I'm expecting to meet with a collection of legislators from Europe, the MEP, the European Parliament. And I think those are exactly the kinds of conversations we should have. Here is the value we want to preserve. Here are the potential hazards of attempting to impose with legislation solutions to problems that introduce even worse problems if you care about the value of the Internet.
Okay, thank you, Vint. We have 2 minutes left, and I'm seeing a new hand from Mutigi Cliff. I don't know, Mutigi, can you just make a very quick comment, because we're closing down now here. It's the end.
All right, thank you so much for the presentations. Just one point I want to remark on is that I believe that internet fragmentation is a threat to growing economies like that of the country I'm in, Uganda. We constantly get internet shutdowns whenever we have elections. Plus, there is a lot of internet censorship when it comes to things like over-the-top tax, the social media tax. This is a very, very big topic up for discussion here in Uganda. And I believe okay, my question is, how can we engage government, or how can we educate government about the dangers of their actions like internet censorship and then internet shutdowns?
Okay, thank you, Tatiana, and I'm very happy that you're here with us. And I think that the developing world impacts of this stuff really has to become more front center in all the conversations about this. And it's something that I want to try to do in some future sessions as well. I think we've kind of addressed that. I don't know if there's anybody who wants to come back on that particular point, or should I just? I think we're just gonna leave that there. And I think the question you're asking is very important. So let me first of all say thank you to everybody for your engagement on this. It's been, I think, a really interesting conversation and indicative of where the debate around fragmentation is these days. We will not be meeting in this seminar series in December, the holidays and so on. It's impossible. Our next meeting will be January 19th, Thursday, on the topic Wither the Internet Governance Forum. The UN's annual IGF, of course, will have concluded on December 2 here, and there will have been much debate within there's been much debate within the IGF ecosystem and among governments, including the EU heads of state and so on, and in the UN Secretary General's Global Digital Compact process about the future of the IGF and whether and how it could be made more politically salient, its outcomes made more concrete, the whole thing institutionally reformed. And of course, looking down the road in 2025, the UN General Assembly will decide on whether to renew the IGF's mandate as part of its WSIS plus 20 review process. So there's a lot of debate going on right now about the future of the IGF and how to take it forward. And I think we will hopefully have as vibrant a discussion then about that topic. So I encourage you all to come back for that. I thank you for your participation here, and I turn it over to Ellie. Ellie.
You're muted, Ellie. Ellie, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill, for organizing and leading this. Thank you, Jason Buckwitz, for running this in the background. Very, very helpful. Thank you. And to the speakers, the great team, Vinton, Andrew, and Tatiana, thank you very much. I'd like to also to add an announcement about an upcoming event that we are organizing December 1st, also at 11 o'clock. We will have speakers, very good speakers, very independent speakers from Russia. From Moscow, the dean of the Moscow State University School of Journalism, Elena Vartanova, and her associate, Daria Vigina, will talk about in the war situation, Russian media, Russian journalism, and Russian journalism education, how they're handling the crisis situation that exists. So we look forward to you participating in that too. Thank you very much. Clearly, we had a very interested and interesting audience here. I thank you for participating, and I'll see you in the near future again. Thank you, everybody.